On December 8, 2024, a man named Bashar Barhoum walked out of prison a free man. Minutes earlier, he was scheduled to be executed by the regime of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. But thanks to a surprise attack by rebels, he was sprung from jail. Just hours later, all of Syria would be celebrating their own freedom. By the end of the day, Assad's capital, Damascus, had fallen to armed opposition groups, and by that night, the dictator himself had fled the country, ending his 23-year iron-fisted rule. And so, with that, we wrap the most important news story of 2024 into one epic 14-year retrospective on Syria's bloody civil war, how it started, who fought in it, and why Bashar al-Assad has finally met his match. First, though, let's go back to the beginning. This video is going to be way too confusing otherwise. In 1970, a Syrian Air Force officer named Hafez al-Assad seized power and ruled the country until his death in 2000. It was then passed down to his son, Bashar al-Assad, also an Air Force officer, despite the fact that he was an eye doctor who was trained in London and knew nothing about politics or ruling a country. That's right. Bashar changed the rules, lowering the minimum age to become president from 40 to 34. When he first took office, Bashar seemed like a reformer, even appearing on the cover of Newsweek magazine in 2000, under the headline, "The Young Lion of Damascus." He loosened restrictions on the press, introduced some economic reforms, and tried to improve relations with the West. For a while, it looked like Syria might become a modern democracy and join the ranks of its newly democratizing neighbors, Jordan and Morocco. Instead, Bashar proved to be a leopard who couldn't change its spots. By 2011, he was back to being an authoritarian dictator, imposing harsh punishments on anyone who opposed him. Why did the shift happen? Well, there were several factors. First, Syria's economy was collapsing. In 2008, GDP growth dropped to less than 1%, and inflation skyrocketed to 30%. The following year, drought forced hundreds of thousands of rural Syrians to flee their homes and move to urban areas, exacerbating existing social tensions. Then there were the protests in Tunisia and Egypt. And when longtime dictators Zine El Abidine Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak were overthrown, Syrians began to think they might be able to do the same. So on March 15, 2011, thousands of protesters marched onto the streets of the southern city of Daraa, calling for democratic reforms and the release of political prisoners. When security forces responded by torturing and killing several teenagers for painting anti-government graffiti, things got very ugly, very quickly. So to put down the rebellion, Assad did what any reasonable dictator would do. He banned funerals. Seriously, that was his first move. He outlawed funerals. This only fueled further anger and resentment against the regime, which responded by beating and shooting unarmed civilians. When that failed, they brought in the tanks. This horrific crackdown pushed many Syrians to take up arms against the regime, forming the core of a rebel army called the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. Within months, the country was engulfed in civil war. Okay, now that we have the backstory out of the way, let's get back to the present. Let's talk about how exactly Assad lost his head. So we know that the war began in 2011, but it wasn't really a full-blown war at first. There were definitely intense battles going on, but both sides kind of kept their powder dry for a few years. Why? Well, because from the start, it was clear that this was going to be more than just a war between the Syrian government and the rebels. It was going to be a proxy war, a sort of second front in the war on terror, with America and its allies supporting the rebels, and Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah backing Assad. As soon as fighting broke out, the US, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia flooded the Syrian opposition with weapons and ammunition. Meanwhile, Assad leaned heavily on the support of the Iranian regime and its most fearsome proxy, Hezbollah. Also, while it was going on, Assad released some 20,000 extremist prisoners from Syrian jails, believing they would be more afraid of the rebels than him. And what could be more terrifying than al-Qaeda? Well, not much. These extremists went on to form the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda, known as al-Nusra, and then later the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. ISIS and the Syrian army battled for control of territory in the early days of the war, but it was the Syrian army that came out on top. By 2015, ISIS had been pushed out of most of Syria, except for a few pockets in the east and northeast, near the Iraqi border. One of those pockets contained the city of Raqqa, which became the de facto capital of the self-declared caliphate. Here, ISIS ruled like it was the Middle Ages, whipping people for crimes like smoking or drinking alcohol and throwing people off buildings for being gay. But by 2017, American bombers were pounding ISIS positions daily, eventually helping Kurdish forces capture the city. Around that time, Assad was also losing ground in the north. The FSA had taken control of parts of Aleppo, Syria's biggest city. But perhaps the biggest blow to the regime came in 2013 when one of its warplanes carried out a chemical attack on a town called Ghouta. Assad's forces gassed over 1,000 civilians, including hundreds of children, earning them a rare unanimous condemnation from the United Nations Security Council and the title of war criminals. But in 2015, Russia entered the war on Assad's side, and everything changed. Russian air power gave Assad's forces the upper hand. Over the next 4 years, they gradually retook all of the territory they had lost, including Aleppo in 2016. And by 2019, it looked like the rebels had no chance of winning. But while Assad had regained all the territory he had lost by 2019, the war was far from over. He still had to deal with ISIS. And although they controlled little territory at that point, they were still a threat. To be fair to ISIS, they were still hanging on because of the chaos caused by the COVID pandemic in 2020. They weren't able to carry out large attacks anymore. But as soon as things settled down, they were right back to their old tricks, which included massacring Syrian civilians and targeting Assad's military infrastructure with suicide bombings. This forced Assad to keep a lot of his troops stationed in the eastern part of the country where ISIS was still active. In the meantime, the rebels in the northwest, in Idlib province, were living on borrowed time. All the big guns had left the country, including Russia, whose support for Assad suddenly dried up in 2022 when it invaded Ukraine. With their main source of military aid gone, the rebels were easy prey for Assad's forces. But the dictator didn't make his move immediately. He waited until 2024. And when Russia's attention was consumed by its war in Ukraine, Assad felt confident enough to act. But his biggest mistake was underestimating the resilience of his enemies. On November 2024, just 3 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, the rebel forces launched a counteroffensive. Within 2 weeks, they had defeated Assad's military forces, capturing the strategic city of Aleppo and pushing south towards Damascus. By December, Assad's entire country was in open revolt. Soldiers loyal to the dictator refused to fight, citing unpaid wages. They defected in mass, leaving Assad with no choice but to flee to Russia. Hours later, rebels poured into the Syrian capital and wrested control of the city. Celebrations erupted across the nation as people danced in the streets waving the red, white, and green flag of the revolution. Then came the looting. Thousands of Syrians descended upon Assad's palaces, which were abandoned by their elite guards. They stole furniture, TVs, clothes, and anything else they could get their hands on. The mob even pulled down statues of Assad's father and grandfather, ending the 54-year rule of the Assad dynasty. And so that ends the story of how Assad lost his head. But there's a twist. We don't actually know who controls Syria now. Yes, Assad is gone, but there are multiple armed factions vying for power. The largest of these is HTS, an Islamist group formerly linked to al-Qaeda, which took control of Idlib after Assad's forces retreated. They have around 15,000 fighters and have established an interim government in exile. Led by ex-al-Qaeda member Julani, HTS hopes to win international recognition and establish a legitimate government in post-Assad Syria. But not everyone is happy with this outcome. Many Syrians wanted to replace Assad's dictatorship with a democratic system, not another authoritarian one. Others want independence from foreign powers like Iran and Russia. Anyway, we'll see what happens. But one thing's for sure, it's going to be a wild ride. Thank you for watching.